Thanks for having me. I met some of you at RubyConf, which was awesome, but I didn't get to come to Melbourne, so thanks for having me. If I'm a little slow or a little tired, it's 4:30 in the morning here, so I'll do my best. Um, so we're going to talk about building Rails plugins. I'm going to do my best to kind of do the high-level stuff in about 20 minutes. So. Um, I maintain and have built a handful of Rails plugins. Um, the most popular one is Access Tenant, which is for multi-tenancy. I maintain that, but have built several other, handful of other gems doing the same kind of things, extending Rails to add some features. I don't have anywhere near the downloads that Tenderlove does. I got, what was it, almost 14 million downloads, but Tenderlove with his 15.5 billion downloads is kind of insane. So what is a Rails plugin? Well, it's a Ruby gem, first and foremost. It's just just like any other Ruby gem that is out there, except it has a few things that hook into Rails. In your gem file, when you spin up a new Rails app, you're going to get a gem file that has a handful of gems in there, and several of these, or most of these, are Rails plugins themselves. So they'll hook into the asset pipeline and other things like that. Maybe you're using SolidQ or Sidekick, and they'll hook into Rails to provide a job queue adapter. So Rails plugins can add things like routes, models, views, controllers, jobs, you name it, just the same stuff that you would do in your regular Rails application, but they can be extracted and shared and reused and all that good stuff. Sidekick's a good one. It provides that job queue adapter on the back end, but it can also provide its own UI and assets and things like that. So, you can get a little dashboard, same with like mission control jobs, as well as a good example there. So there are two types of Rails plugins, Railties and engines. Technically, engines can be two different types themselves, so we'll talk about that in a minute. So there's really like three different types, but the main distinction between these is that Railties don't provide any like models or anything like that, like your main Rails application would have. These are primarily like very lightweight. They can add initializers, configuration, things like reg tasks, but it's more like the bare bones version of a Rails plugin. An engine builds on top of that with the same features, but you can also have the app folder where you can put your models, views, controllers. You can add routes to the application, set up locales, but also do your tasks and other stuff like you would with a Railtie. Your Rails app is an engine. It's kind of the core engine in your application. And if you don't believe me, Raphael, the Rails policeman, tweeted this not too long ago about, your Rails app is an engine. So if this seems scary or whatever, it's not. The stuff you do every day is exactly the same. So to spin up your first Rails plugin, you just run Rails plugin new and give it a name. And we can do Rails plugin new and call it my Railtie. It's going to spin up a gem with one extra file in it, your railtie.rb file. And this is what Rails keeps track of and says, oh, okay, you want to integrate with Rails. And it doesn't do anything by default, but you can use that to hook into load hooks and other stuff. If we do Rails plugin new, my engine -- full, this is going to create a Rails plugin that functions a lot like a regular Rails application. So you get an app folder, you can add models, migrations, routes, all that good stuff. So this is interesting too, because your routes file here is actually going to draw routes directly to the application. So if you've ever used Active Storage, it will draw routes directly to your Rails app. So when you run Rails routes, you'll see it right there. And then we also have mountable engines, which are kind of like namespaced and isolated. So you'll see an option. You only see the first screen. Are you seeing the current slide with mountable engines?
Nope.
No,
I see.
you just did a first one.
Interesting. Let's see what's going on here. I wonder why that isn't.
Oh, you found the pause button in Zoom, I think. No, it's very frustrating.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I think there might be a Go Rails video on this actually.
Let's see, maybe it's a different thing here. I'm not sure. Share screens. Share. So you guys missed all of this?
Yes,
Dang. Wow.
Very engaging talk. It was only that there when we were like, maybe this was supposed to be seeing something.
Everyone was engaged with it.
That's funny. So yeah. We'll just speed through this part then. That's funny. So we went through all this, Ruby gems, looked at your gem file in your Rails app, plugins, Sidekicks dashboard, for example, and then Railties versus engines, the features you can use on each of those. Your Rails app is an engine, Raphael's tweet from March, and then your different Rails plugin types. So this is a Railtie. You basically get a plain Ruby gem with a Railtie class generated for you. Same with the engine -- full, you get an engine.rb file, but you also get the app folder and config routes. So that is all very familiar to your Rails application because it's basically a Rails engine that's the not isolated version. And so the mountable ones are like this, where you have an engine file, you have your app folder and everything, but you get this isolate namespace, which is going to separate all of the stuff like the routes between the engine and the main Rails application. So if you want to reference routes in between these two, you actually go through the helpers in order to do that. So it generates some helpers to make that possible. So with these mountable Rails engines, you tell it, hey, mount this to this location in my routes file, and then it will use that as name in order to generate this little helper that you can use in your controllers and your views. And so you basically have like multiple separate routes, route helpers or groups. So that you might use this, for example, if you're building like an admin gem or like Sidekick. Sidekick's UI is a mountable engine like that, where you can just mount that and visit the /sidekick or wherever you decide to mount it. Then in your isolated mountable Rails engine, you can also go the opposite direction. From the engine, you can link to routes using this main app helper, and it will know that your Rails application is where it needs to talk to for those routes. So of course, you're building a Ruby gem for Rails plugins, so you can add dependencies. You probably by default will just add Rails itself as a dependency, but if you're building a plugin for Rails that just adds something to active record, it's probably better just to add the active record dependency instead of all of Rails. And so one of the big things that you end up doing in libraries like this is you will spend a lot of your time on load, order, and hooks. And so you'll want to understand how Rails boots. And at a very high level, Rails boots up. It requires all your plugins with bundler, and then it starts to load those engine and Railtie classes. And then it's going to have all those initializers ready so that it can run the initializers from those plugins, and then your application initializers will run after that. So we can define initializers instead of in files under config initializers. We can put them inside the Railtie or the engine and do something when Rails boots up. So a good example of this is the prefixed IDs gem that I have. I really liked Stripe's IDs for all of the different API records. It's really handy to be able to see that. They put like for example, a user underscore and then the ID, or sub underscore and the ID for subscriptions. So at a glance, you as a developer can look at the ID and know what type it is, instead of it just being like a number or a UUID that could easily get mixed up with different types. That's what this gem does. And basically, we have a little module to add that feature, and we just need to wait until active record is loaded. So we set up an initializer saying, hey, let's wait until active record is loaded. Inside this block, it will be evaluated on active record base, and we can include our module, and this will take care of any reloading or whatever might happen in development as well. So if active record got loaded twice for whatever reason, because it reloaded, then this would run every time. And the way this works internally in Rails, you have the active record base class. It includes all these other modules. And then at the very end, after the class is defined, it runs the load hooks and passes that base class, which is what our block gets evaluated inside of. So it uses like an instance eval or exec in there. There are tons of load hooks available. So if you're integrating with Action Cable or any of the Rails frameworks, there's usually a hook for integrating with that stuff. And this is really important. I just fixed someone else's gem that was loading active record in the boot process too early, which was causing other things to break randomly. So if you run into a gem like that, it might be that it's not actually using these load hooks in order to extend one of the Rails frameworks. Admin's another gem that I've worked on that provides admin interface for Rails, and there's a handful of different things we do there. Like we register an app admin folder with Rails to kind of namespace that and have it organized more like a nested version of the Rails folders that expect like a, products controller and have those patterns of naming and the namespaces. So we use the config before configuration callback to register those paths with Rails. There's a to prepare block, which you might have used in your Rails apps as well, where basically when Rails reloads in development, you can do some work. And so here we set up resetting of our resources. So basically we look at all your models and say, hey, here's all the models we want to display in the admin area. And then whenever that reloads in development, we can catch any of those new ones. And then you can also use this to register assets as well. This is pretty common for gems that provide UIs or whatever. They might have CSS or JavaScript that needs to be given to the asset pipeline to render those out properly. So there's a whole bunch of different things you can do with this. And oftentimes I will look at the Rails source code to figure out how I want to do something, or look at other gems like mission control jobs or whatever that provide a UI that, the Rails core team or someone at 37 Signals has added. You can also add rack middleware. So I had a great idea, and government employees also do as well. We should have our website only work during business hours. So I made a gem called 9 to 5. It's also strangely my least popular gem. I haven't figured out why. And it's pretty simple. So basically we have a Railtie. We add the middleware into the Rails middleware stack. And this middleware is just a rack class that basically takes the request. We check to see if it runs during business hours, and we'll let it through to Rails. Otherwise, we'll give you an error message here. And we just have a simple little check here to see if it's between 9 and 5. And so it looks like this when you're outside of the 9 to 5 hours, which is great. So this leads me to configuration. We have a bunch of different ways of handling configuration for libraries. This is kind of the way like Devise will do it, is having module adder accessors where you can define these module level variables and change them. And this works great. It's simple. You can just, change your business hours like that. But we can also use a couple things that Rails provides itself. So here we can assign config.9 to 5 as an ordered options object. And this is like it inherits from a hash, but basically makes sure that all the keys and everything are symbols. And then when you call a method on it, it will actually go look up that key from the method name inside of the hash. So we can use this to make it feel a lot more Railsy by using the ordered options object, which is pretty cool. And that allows you to, in your Rails application, you can say, we'll go from 10 to 6 instead, and then set up our custom response, for example. And it is much, more the Rails style of configuration this way, which is nice. We can also have generators in our Rails plugins. A good example of this is, so basically, Rails is getting all this new built-in authentication stuff, and I thought, it'd be cool to take that and use it without, and Rails 8 is getting the generators for most of the things. I don't think registration is going to be part of it, but I thought it'd be cool to use all that and build a gem kind of like Devise, so I called mine Revise, and added generators to it, which will be detected automatically when you run Rails generate. And you can do whatever you want here. So you can tell it, hey, I want, when you're looking for templates, I want it to be inside of the directory where this gem lives. So you can use relative paths like that. So the templates can be in the gem, but you can also override them in your Rails application, which is handy. You can also hook into other generators from other gems. So for example, you can hook into the ORM generator, which will be active record primarily. You can swap that out too. But you can tell it, hey, let's invoke the active record generate model command and have it generate a user model with these fields. And then we can do all the fun stuff where Thor provides us the features of like, let's inject a line into the class in this file, for example. So it's able to find the file, open that, read it, look for class user inside of there, and then insert that line right afterwards as well. So you can do all kinds of cool stuff with this, like adding routes as well. You can also extend the Rails generators, which is neat. So the JBuilder gem, which is included with Rails by default, actually overrides Rails scaffold controller generator and basically adds itself to the paths. So it will look at the JBuilder gem for templates first, which overrides the templates that are inside of Rails. And then that way they can include the controller with the HTML and the JSON responses and generate those templates for it, which is pretty cool. So you can go and do this in your own libraries, or you could do this in your Rails application itself. And this is what it looks like. So basically just has this controller.rb file under the gems lib generators Rails templates, and it overrides it just like you might do in your own Rails application. Your plugins for Rails can also include models and migrations. Here's SolidQ. It has an app model SolidQ folder with a bunch of different models and migrations in DB migrate. Same thing as you would do in your Rails application. You just toss them in the gem. But the one thing that is different is when you add SolidQ or any Rails plugin to your app, you actually have to run the install migrations command. So it'll be the gem name, :install, :migrations, and it will go look at the DB migrate folder from the gem, copy those over, and generate timestamps for them. And it keeps track of that by adding the .solidq.rb at the end. So you know that those migrations came from a gem or a plugin. And it also adds a comment at the top of those, so it kind of modifies them slightly when it copies them over, just to help you keep track of that stuff as it changes. You can also extend the Rails console, which you don't see very often, but the mission control jobs library actually does this. It registers a handful of commands. I think just these two were the original ones. It might have more now, but you have connect to and jobs help. Those are commands that you can get only inside of the Rails console. and they register using this brand new IRB command interface that was recently added to IRB. Originally, when I had my slides for this, it was including a console methods module, but now it's got an actual interface for these. So basically, you just implement an execute method inside the class, and you can just toss this inside of your gem and have those registered when your library starts up. So this is pretty handy if you want to do any cool stuff like that where you need access in the terminal. So that was the quick rundown of Rails plugins and engines. There's a whole bunch of other stuff like testing using like the appraisals gem, which I really like being able to test. For example, some of the gems we test against 3 or 4 different databases, and then 4 or 5 different Ruby versions, and 3 or 4 different versions of Rails, and need all those permutations to pass. So when we throw it up on GitHub Actions, it can be, it gets their hamster wheels running pretty fast, because there's so many different things that we need to make sure that if we're using JSON queries or something, we have to make sure that that works, because every database implements the JSON columns and their syntax and everything differently. So it can be kind of a pain to make sure that this works across databases or whatever. So that's kind of the high level of what you can do with Rails engines. All of this is pretty similar to what you would do day to day, except for, you're going to be hooking in to those Rails frameworks using load hooks for the most part. So that is it.
Do we have any questions for Chris? Yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
So, interested, you can hear me, right? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I'll talk loudly. Interested to see you're recommending gems add middleware like that. As somebody who recently spent like a month reordering all of Zendesk's middleware, I'm curious, how do you think about what should go in middleware versus what should go like as hooks in action controller or application controller?
Good question. Yeah, I would generally let you choose, or have some way of like, the 9 to 5 gem is mostly just a joke. So that one's like, just inject it wherever. But in general, like, yeah, if you are going to use, I think it's best to have stuff in Rails land, because it's so much more easy to see and find, because the middleware tends to kind of be invisible. You have to run rake or Rails middleware to see the middleware stack as it boots and everything. And if you're going to do that, you need to be able to choose exactly where it goes. But like the Rails 7.2 rate limiting, that could have been a rack middleware. It's not. It's actually just a before action that it defines when you say rate limit. And I think that's a lot better, because you also, unlike, I think Phoenix does this, where you can have different middleware stacks for different routes. Rails just has the one stack, so you don't really get a lot of control over that if you want to run it for a specific route. So in general, I would do a before action or something like that, so that it's a bit more flexible and more findable.
Yeah.
So
Stuff like skip before action as well, if you need as well, right?
exactly, yeah, and that's a cool example too of Rails 8's authentication generators. Add an authentication module. It adds a before action to always authenticate, and then you have a allow unauthenticated access that you can use, and all that does is set a skip before action. So by default, everything's locked down. Then, and it's kind of the opposite if you've used Devise or other gems, where you have to go tell it, hey, I want to lock this stuff down. It's kind of the opposite, where it's locked down by default, and you want to say, hey, I want to skip that, which I think is a better approach, or whatever, for most applications that are, like Zendesk or Basecamp or whatever, where it's like, yeah, generally this whole thing is you know, locked down by default. And then you could say like, we have an unauthenticated controller that's like a base class for all the marketing pages or whatever else we might want to have. It's just a little bit safer that way.
Questions?
All right.
It was too clear of a talk.
Quick question, is slide gonna be available?
Michael's asking if this slide's gonna be available somewhere.
Yeah, I can upload them. I'll do that. Put them on slide deck or something.
Cool. All right, thanks, Chris.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.